center district, the businesses. They can't compete with things that have happened. It's been an outside influence, but it affects us, and so it's up to us to fix that. And so I think one of the things we may take from Dr. Sachs is, when she talks about this, is maybe we need a new cadre of planners that are dedicated to create a new vision for Norris. There are several people that are interested in that. I don't think it's going to be an easy job. I don't think it's a short job, but I think it's a needed job. And so that's the challenge I think we have in front of us. With that, I'll introduce Dr. Sachs. She's Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Tennessee. She's Interim Associate Dean for Research. She has now authored 2 books, the one she's going to talk about, and she has a second TVA book that's at the printing press now, and it'll be out soon, called the Mechanized Landscape. It's on TVA, so that'll be available soon. So with that, will you welcome Dr. Sachs?
Thank you so much, Larry. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for being on a beautiful sunny day. I usually speak to people who are not as familiar with this landscape as you, I'm sure, are. So I thought that this time I would actually begin with a little bit about myself. And you really gave me a wonderful opening by mentioning David Macaulay, because he was part of why I became an architect. My parents decided that I was good at form and space when I was young, but didn't want to tell me that this is what I should do. And so they gave me David Macaulay books. And then at a certain point, I said, yes, I want to be an architect. So I studied architecture, and I also worked as an architect. But from the very beginning, it was very clear to me that I was interested in the history of architecture as much as I was in the actual practice of architecture. Sorry, let me try and get this back to where we're supposed to be. And so after quite a few years working as an architect, I decided to go and do a PhD in architecture. And I now teach at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and have been there for about 16 years. It came for one, and I'm still in East Tennessee. I think that should say everything. There we go. I begin with this because the reason for writing this book, besides just the fascination of being in East Tennessee and seeing Norris and seeing the environment which you're all familiar with, was the fact that listening to my colleagues and listening to students, I realized that we have, I think, in architecture and in landscape architecture, a really fundamental problem. We talk a lot about visions, we talk a lot about great ideas, but we rarely talk about how they can then become a reality, and what does it mean to take a vision and to make it into a reality. And what that often creates is a situation where some architects are talking about beautiful drawings and visions and things like that, and others are talking about practice. And to my mind, there was too much of a divide between the two. There was too much, it's either this or this, and students thought that they either had to go be artists or they could just go and do work as an architect, and couldn't see the fact that you could balance between these two things. The second part of this is that working as an architect, I realized that I was being very creative. I was responding to a lot of challenges, not necessarily the ones I did in architecture school. And I really wanted my students to appreciate that going into practice might not be a direct continuation of architecture school. You might discuss different things, you'll be working with different people, but it wasn't suddenly giving up your creativity. So these were the things that were in my mind when I was writing my dissertation and began writing more full-time as an architectural historian. And what I was really looking for is good stories in which I could tell and explain what this actually meant. And the TVA was an absolutely perfect example. Because here we have a group of people whom, as I hope to show you, were very committed to a set of ideas, utopian even, but were also very aware that if they left the TVA, they would not have work. So they had to balance between the requirements, their own ideology, and the workings of a very big machine, which was making major differences. Beyond that, it was something that was sustained. The people I will mention, or I'll talk more about their work than about the people, worked for the TVA for about 20 years, which for architects is a relatively long frame of time. So that is the main impetus behind the book, The Garden and the Machine, which Larry mentioned. As I was working on that, I was very frustrated because I wanted to understand how the TVA changed the landscape. I was especially wanted to know which dams were built first. And I complained to a junior colleague of mine, and he said, well, why don't we make those maps? That's a great idea. So we started talking about the TVA. That was in 2017, quite a while ago, and slowly developed a second project, which we worked on in parallel. This is a project that combines some text, but more importantly, maps that Micah Rutenberg, that's my colleague, made based on historical material that I collected, and a series of photographs that I was taking, which is why I was wandering around Norris on a pretty regular basis. So color photographs that I will show you are all mine. If they're black and white, they're mostly the TVA's, and they're more archival. And the mechanized landscape is going to literally go into press later this month, so it should be available early in 2026, but not quite there. The Garden and the Machine, I'm glad to share with you. So let me begin by saying that when I say that I'm taking people to Norris, or what at the college we call it the Dam Tour, I'm talking about more than the town of Norris, so of course that's a very big part of what I'm talking about. And I start with this image because I have not yet managed to take a good picture of what it means to live in Norris, Tennessee, and I think that's because I don't really know, and you can all tell me better. But the point I want to make that it's not just the town with the center, with the school, with the industry, with the houses. Here's one of the houses. And I apologize, the light here is very light in the screen, but I hope that works too. But and in the entire environment around us. So when I bring visitors here, I also show them the Norris Freeway and how it connects between Rocky Top and Knoxville going through Norris. Certainly take them to the dam. And many of them are surprised how much this is not just a piece of infrastructure, but also an object. And to many of them, it's very beautiful. We can have a discussion on that. That's absolutely fine. What I love about it is that you can experience it both when it's spilling and at night when suddenly the powerhouse sort of seems to go out into the environment and sort of show itself up. And then if you come at it from another direction, you suddenly see it inside a pastoral landscape, something that you could imagine this being in Central Park or in some other parks in Europe, which to me gives a completely different feeling of the dam about what it is and what it's supposed to be doing. I often point out the visitor center, even when it's closed in the winter, and tell them about what it's like to go into the powerhouse, which I'm really sad that one can no longer do on a regular basis, and just how impressive this space is. Even though, to my mind, it's not as impressive as the view that you get if you walk through the powerhouse and get to the balcony on the other side and get to see the dam from below. To me, that is really the pinnacle of the experience here. And allows one to look at the dam again from different, not only in different contexts and in different light, but also from different points of view. Knowing that how much the TVA was invested in electricity, I always point out the substation, even when it's clouded in mist. And I've also gone looking for some of the old TVA lines, and I'm confident, though I'm not absolutely sure, that this is one of them, not far from here. I usually take people driving through the state park. It's an important part of the story as well, and show them the marina. I don't usually let them get out of the car because then I'll lose them, but that's the way it is. And certainly stop, or at least drive by the groves that are below the dam. And if we have time, go hiking a bit. And I'm sure that you all know this spot way better than I do. So usually this takes longer, but I just wanted you to get a feeling for when I talk about Norris, what it is that I am referring to. And what I'd like to do is, as I said with the book, The Garden and the Machine, is begin by describing what the vision behind this garden, as I call it, what the vision behind it was. Then talk a little bit, but not at great length, about why there was even an opportunity to make this vision a reality. Because most visions that architects talk about are just visions. And we talk about them and they don't really happen. And finally, and for me the most interesting part, what happened when the architects and landscape architects, the cadre, whom I call the atelier, which is a word that for architecture students is very, very familiar, but I'm realizing doesn't have as wide an appeal as I thought it did. What happened when they actually started making their vision a reality and working within the TVA machine, and what actually came out of that? which to me is the fascinating part. So to begin talking about their vision, I need to distinguish between two terms which are actually very close, and in most discourses the difference between is not that important. One is regional planning and the other is resource conservation. For my purposes, however, and in the circles of planning and design, the difference is actually quite fundamental. I'm talking about two ideas that came up in the late 19th and especially the early 20th century, a time in which people both in England and the United States were very concerned with the rise of socialism and the rise of communism, and about the impact and about how much those ideas spoke to people who were experiencing the life of working in factories and so on, and began to consider how one might reform, in other words, not completely upend, but reform and change things in the modern world so as to make capitalism and the system of land ownership and so on, which was true in both Britain and the United States, more plausible and more possible for people. Daniel Rogers has written a really interesting book that I highly recommend if you're interested in this period, usually referred to as the progressive period, calls it Atlantic Crossings, because it really was two groups of people discussing these ideas, moving between the two places. But at the same time, one can also see how the context in each place shaped some of the ways that people thought about what they were doing. So in the British context, where people were much more used to being part of communities, we're used to having things done the right way. I just visited a friend in Oxford. There were still things that they did like the Middle Ages. It was amazing. Where what things looked like was pretty accepted. People kind of knew that. The main idea that developed, which I'm calling here regional planning, was an idea about creating the right environment for people. And the person who was most behind this, or sort of generated most of these ideas, was actually a biologist named Patrick Geddes. He was Scottish, so he begins by studying the connection between animals and plants and their environments. This is, of course, a period when people are working out what Darwin's theory of evolution really means on the ground. But about halfway through his career, he begins to apply this to people too, and to say, wait a minute, the same idea of fit and of the good fit between an animal and its environment can also be useful if we think about people, and especially if we think about people and what their good life is. Because yes, people can survive in bad environments, and for him, anything that had to do with big cities and sprawl and factories and so on were bad environments. But from his point of view, let's talk about thriving. Let's not just talk about surviving. And so he began taking these, and I'm purposely showing you, and it's okay, nobody ever understands these diagrams, even his closest friends never did. The one that he used that did become most popular, and you may have come across, is what he called the valley section, in which he argued, and this really is a sort of a vision of the world, is that people are happiest and most productive and most artistically productive. Civilizations flower when there is this fit between who the people are and the regions that they live in. And he specifically used the miner and the woodman, the hunter, the shepherd and peasant and so on as a way of talking about this. Now this is, I think, I hope you'll see with me, a very beautiful idea in the sense of people needing an environment that is conducive both to their hearts and their souls and their minds. It does have a fundamental flaw, though, in that it really puts people in a particular place. And it's hard for me to imagine what happens if a fisher wants to become a woodman. And the answer would be that for Patrick Geddes and a lot of other people, that wasn't a terribly important question. The question of free choice, the question of free will, was mostly reserved to a small cadre of elite people who would be creating these environments. And most people were expected to sort of fall in line and fall in place according to the environment they produced. This idea was married with another idea, which again, you're even more likely to have come across, the idea of a garden city, or the official title of one of two books by Ebenezer Howard was Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform. And he added a very important component to the story, which is that people are going to have to share things if this is going to work. That in a world of private ownership, only the very rich have the opportunity to create environments that you can actually enjoy. But if people band together and form communities, and these communities people in these communities work together, and then also these communities are set out in the environment in such a way that they are protected from developments like, like Clinton and the highway and things like that, not only by distance, but also by green belts surrounding them. In other words, if you manage and direct people about where to live and how to live, you can create environments in which people can thrive. There's more to say about this, but let me stop here for the sake of talking more about the TVA. The important thing is that these ideas were taken up by a group of people who called themselves the Regional Planning Association of America. They came out of a committee of the American Institute of Architects, but the group came to include people not only trained as architects, also as planners, people were working who were lobbying for housing. It was a wide group of people. And they a leading person among them was Lewis Mumford. He was the one who wrote and took a lot of Patrick Geddes' ideas and made them more available. And they also, some of them actually made places that were supposed to demonstrate what this was about. And among them was someone named Benton MacKaye, who was the one who proposed the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, the Appalachian Trail was part of this bigger vision. The idea that you can think of the Appalachian Trail as a sort of garden city writ large. The idea was that by having people walk along the Appalachian Trail, small communities living on the land, and in his vision, people would be given land by the government, would live on it, would work on it together, and would be able to preserve a lot of the traditional life and things like that. And as you can see, Benton MacKaye, even before the TVA, goes further and starts imagining how this could be the beginning of a lot of other things. So that is, very, very briefly, one strand of the more European or the more British way of thinking about things. As I said, there's a lot of contact between Europeans and Americans, but the context in the United States is a bit different in that the idea of your own freedom and liberty plays such a bigger role than it does in the British context. And to me, that's really what history is about understanding where some of these conflicts are and not necessarily doing what people did before us, but understanding what it is we're choosing between. But here too, and I'm using these two images, and I'm sorry if they're very faint. It's a map of how the United States extended to westward and just a drawing of a pioneer. These were drawings that were made for the Little House in the Big Woods series. Here too, the idea of an environment and having a good environment is a very central idea. But rather than an environment that is made centrally and then you are directed to live on it and then you work with the people you live with and flower in that environment, the idea of the frontier is that you go and find an environment that isn't ready for you, find a wilderness, to use the terms that people were using, and transform it through your own labor and the labor of your family. In other words, through hard work and ingenuity and entrepreneurship and free choice and free will, into an environment that is conducive, is a pastoral environment, as Leo Marx calls it, and one where you yourself can flower both financially, but even more importantly, as a citizen in a democracy and as part of culture and community. At the end of the 19th century, of course, this frontier is disappearing. The census of 1890 showed that there was no part of North America that didn't have enough European settlers to be considered part of the United States. In other words, that the frontier was closed. But the idea that this was the basis for American culture, that this connection between people and environments and the importance of people actually working in the environment is the key to what makes the United States unique. Certainly remained, beginning with this book, which is The Frontier in American History by Frederick Jackson Turner, which is published in the very late 19th century, where he basically tells the story of the individual pioneer and how important he is. And then later with books such as The Little House in the Big Woods books, which were written in the 1930s during the Great Depression, the beginning, which also tell a very, very similar story. An important thing to know is that by the 1930s, one of the areas in the United States that is most associated with this idea of frontier and frontier life are the mountains right here, is Appalachia. And that's partly just because they were, comparatively, from a material culture point of view, behind most other places in the United States. And we can look at the historical context and the physical, geographical context and see why that is. In other words, there are good reasons for them being identified this way. But even more importantly, a lot of these reformers, progressive reformers, especially in the United States, were hoping for a better future and recreating the pioneer story and having an opportunity to bring a region such as Appalachia into modernity and see pioneers actually working was a very, very exciting idea. And so Appalachia became a topic of conversation for people well outside this region, and concerns and worries about what it was, what it represented, did it remain as a sort of frontier because of divine interference, or was it just an environmental question? These are all things that people are talking about. So again, I'm being brief, but these are two ideas that are on the table. And many people in the late 19th, are on the table. When people are looking at Appalachia and the other frontier, their question is, well, how do we make it continue? And their answer is, the reason people are no longer able to live the life of pioneers is that we're running out of resources. The frontier is closed, there's no more land, people can't just move west and go off on their own. And they were especially concerned that big companies and rich individuals were using resources beyond what they needed, taking away the opportunity from individual families to actually go through the process of becoming good Americans. And that's where resource conservation comes in. Sorry, I made a note for myself, but that's why I needed the notes. The idea here was that the government would interfere, but only insofar as conserving and developing resources, and stop short of doing what what regional planners, especially Britain, recommended, of creating a specific environment. The government would produce the resources, put them on the table, so to speak, and then people would have the opportunity to go through this life-changing experience of making their own lives and becoming part of a democratic society. So these are the two ideas now on the table. And for many people in progressive circles, especially in the 1920s, they didn't necessarily distinguish between them, or if they distinguished between them, it wasn't necessarily that important. These are all topics that people are talking about, but in the 1920s have very little expectation that anything that they will say will actually come to pass. One of them, of course, is Senator George Norris of Nebraska, and who was very much a progressive in his politics, and very much interested in taking these ideas about the environment and the connection between people and environment and making them into a reality. And he became interested in the Tennessee Valley, mostly because the federal government owned Wilson Dam and the beginning of two factories they'd started building them during World War I, so as to produce ammunition for World War I. They weren't finished in time, so they were just the beginning of factories. And this was land that was owned by the public government, by the federal government, which was an anomaly. There was no land that wasn't forests or open for settlement. It was this new kind of thing of some kind of industrial land. And as you may know, there were attempts to sell it to Ford, who only offered $1 million, if not $5 million. So those fell through. And Norris and others started agitating and saying, this is our opportunity to try out these progressive ideas. This is our opportunity to move from just letting things happen, letting people go along the frontier, to something more like resource conservation, where we actually manage the water, and we manage land, and we manage soil, and we manage electricity and things like that, and give people opportunities. Norris himself would probably have also gone further and said, let's do regional planning as well, but at this point, he's settling for whatever he can get. Now, one of the things that my students like to imagine is that if you have a really good idea and you visualize it well and you explain it, that eventually you'll convince people. And I'm afraid that as an historian, I have to tell them that's usually not the case. What usually happens is there's a big crisis, things look very dire for a while, and then there's opportunity to make some change. And that's certainly what happened in this case. I don't want to belabor the story of the TVA, but I think it is important to point out that it's part of the New Deal, that it is, the TVA Act is enacted and signed into law during the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was many things, but for a lot of people, it was also the fear that, that the entire American way of life would fall apart. That without resources, as this depression was showing people, there would be no entrepreneurship, free will, freedom, liberty, all of these things. In other words, it was an opportunity to bring ideas which had been sort of there on the left for quite a while and bring them much more into the center. But at the same time, because it was done under crisis and during a time of a lot of confusion, the TVA Act is a very messy thing. Or at least from my perspective, of the perspective of the architects, in that it is mostly about resource conservation, as I'll show you in just a moment, but it has an element of regional planning in it. There was a little bit, because Roosevelt and others were interested in these ideas, were sort of slipped in, but they weren't made the center of the idea. Just before that, let me say that the, and I'm sorry if this is not clear, I'm glad to show it to you later, just how unusual the idea of taking an entire watershed and making it into a region and giving a federal agency responsibility of it was. This map always brings that home to me. Most of the United States had no regulations or zoning at all. As you can see, out west and in Florida, there are more areas or more counties that have developed such things. But even against those, the watershed, the TVA, is simply enormous. And this is part of the way that the TVA Act really marked a shift from we let people, from laissez-faire, we let people do what they want, to something that's more resource conservation. We take responsibility. Well, that's what I want to talk about. What do we take responsibility for? And just to say that you've probably heard that the idea was that the TVA would be the first of several. And this is a map that I found that was actually produced by the National Planning Board in the 1930s, drawing out what that would actually mean. It didn't happen, which is partly why I get to stand here and tell you about how special your environment is, so I won't complain. So, as I said, the TVA Act was a mix of a lot of things, but predominantly based in the idea of resource conservation. And Micah and I, the more we talked about it, the more we realized that though it has a lot of different things, there are three things that are really important. And we like to think of them as the three machines. So the first one was everything to do with water, or the river. And the problem that people were experiencing flooding along the river, together with the expectation that working on the river, including dredging it and widening it and making it into what it is today, would support the development of commerce and industry along the river. And so these two ideas, together with some other subsets, are what we think of as the river machine. And the important thing from my story today is that the river machine was a very controlled project. To build a dam, you had to buy land, which the TVA was authorized to do. You then had to move people off it. You had to bring people to build in the dam. You had to build the dam. You then the reservoir completely destroyed, miles and miles of river and so on. But at the same time, there was a clear start. There was a clear finish. It was clear what was bought, what wasn't bought. It was a relatively self-contained project. And it's mostly complete. The TVA board proposes a project in 1936, sort of says this is the scope of what we're going to do. And by 1953, it's pretty much complete. And for 2 decades or so, commerce along the Tennessee was substantially changed by this work. Then interstates were built, and so things changed. The second one we think of as the land machine. And that is everything that had to do with supporting agriculture and forestry in the Tennessee Valley and also in the mountains. And here the key was the fact that the TVA was given responsibility for those factories near Wilson Dam and told, keep them in case we need them for a war, but use them. And that at the time, the processes to make fertilizer and the processes to make ammunition were pretty much the same. So the TVA had the opportunity to produce fertilizers and to distribute them. But here they went about it in a completely different way. And this was partly a matter of personality, but partly a matter of ideology. Instead of taking over land, buying land, which it wasn't allowed to do, what the TVA did was produce these things together with a lot of knowledge about what modern agriculture should be and distributed it to individual landowners. So rather than buying land, this was done through people who were living on the land. And this is just the way that Micah mapped the complexity of producing things in one place and then distributing them to individuals and getting them involved. The idea was that the farmers would become experts or part of the world of expertise and would also report back to the TVA about what they were doing and how well things were going. That project began in full force right away and continued well into the 40s. By the 50s, it's not as important. And I grew up in a very dry place, so to me coming here and seeing forests like this or this kind of farmland is a sign that it worked. But I'm sure it's not just that. It's also the fact that it rains here a lot. And then the third and most controversial part of what the TVA was doing was what we call the power machine, which was the idea of rural electrification. So there was electricity in the valley. Knoxville had electricity, Chattanooga did, but most rural residents did not. And so for the TVA, it was a matter of producing electricity below cost, creating a yardstick for the industry, but then especially most of the work was about transmitting it from where it was produced to other places, which is why I showed you that, why I went looking for one of the original TVA power lines and why I consider it part of the story. As you probably know, this was the part of the TVA that was attacked most directly. This was the TVA being socialist and interfering in free enterprise. And in fact, the power machine basically doesn't get off the ground until the late 30s because it's stopped by multiple lawsuits, and only when the Supreme Court sides with the TVA can they go forward with it. You can still go and see elements of it. This is just an example. The substation at Fort Loudon looks like some kind of spaceship. It's absolutely fantastic. I described these briefly, partly just to say that these are the three things that we were thinking about. This is, reading the TVA Act, these were the things that stood out to us as the three topics of resource conservation. But as I said, there are other parts in the TVA Act, including two sections, 22 and 23, which directed the TVA to engage in planning, produce surveys, do things for the betterment and the welfare of people in the valley. And this is where the story becomes really interesting, because for some people, those two sections were authorization to engage in regional planning, to go further than just resource conservation and really shape the environment, design the environment, create environments for people to live in. For most people in the TVA, to be fair, those were just a funny addition that someone had snuck in at the last minute. The main goal was to conserve resources, produce resources, and create opportunity for people. And the assumption was that if people had economic opportunity, they would also have intellectual and artistic and social opportunity and so on. The reason this story is so important to me is that it impacted the architects and landscape architects dramatically. And that's because, I'm sure you know, there were three directors at the beginning, Arthur Morgan, Harcourt Morgan, and David E. Lilienthal. And Arthur Morgan is appointed before the other two, and he of the three is the most committed to regional planning. He actually sees those two sections in the TVA Act as authorization to take the entire enterprise and make it into a regional planning. And in his mind, the entire valley will be transformed to look something like what Ebenezer Howard suggested with Appalachian trails and so on. The other thing is that that these three directors didn't get along almost from the get-go. And so they basically divided up the three machines amongst themselves. And he was the one who took over the river machine, which, as I said before, was the most centralized, the most top-down planning, the most organized, the one with the most clear-cut parts to it, and with the authority to buy land. In other words, with the opportunity to take an environment and to shape it not through influencing people, but through planning and design, top-down planning and design. And so it is Arthur Morgan who brings in this atelier or a cadre of architects and landscape architects, starting with Earl Draper and Roland A. Vanck and Mario Bianculli and quite a few others who worked with them. Some of them were there before Lilienthal and Harcourt Morgan were even appointed as directors. And basically creates what he calls the Land Planning and Housing Division. It changes names. I tried following TVA nomenclature and I gave up at some point. Land Planning and Housing, and basically says, we're going to start with Cove Creek. We're going to, which ends up being named Norris, and we're going to buy up land around it more than we actually need, so as to be able to demonstrate what this good environment, as the regional planners in Britain and in the United States are describing, so people can actually see what it looks like. Because demonstration through design, architects' favorite words, is the most powerful way to convince people. And so it was actually Land Planning and Housing Division that made decisions about buying land here. And as you may know, or the amount of land, including land that is where we are right now, that is distant from the dam itself, was not repeated again. After Norris, the rest of the TVA said, stop it, this is not what we were authorized to do. You're just using two sections as if they're the whole thing. We should be respecting people's individual rights. The whole point is to conserve resources so they can use it. We only buy what we absolutely need. And that's one reason why this Norris is unique, and everything around it is unique, and why when I bring people here, it's never just about the town or the dam, it's about the entire model as we think about it. So Earl Draper is in charge of the land planning and housing, and the assignment is basically take these ideas that Ebenezer Howard and Patrick Geddes and Lewis Mumford and the RPAA and all these people have been talking about and make them a reality. Benton McKay is hired as well, though the stories are mostly that he's not very useful because he's off thinking about things and he worked during the night and slept during the day. But he was there, and he certainly influenced quite a lot of the younger people and really, confirmed their commitment to these ideas. And so this is an image of actually building the Norris Freeway. I like the fact that you can actually see that people used to live right next to it. They come here. One of the first things that they have to build, of course, is a construction camp, because if the dam is going to be built, people need to live here. I'm showing you the community center, which no longer exists, so some of you, I think it burned down in the 70s sometime. I would have loved to have seen it. But around it, they build an entire construction camp all along Ridgeway Lane or Ridgeway Road. There were large dormitories that were full of people. Some of the dormitories are still there. But most importantly is that they take, and I'm sorry, I'll show them later on the computer if you need to. But most importantly is they take the village part of the construction camp, which was an expected part of construction camps in these times, and turn it into the town that you live in. And so this is, in the very fuzzy drawing, is a landscape architect's drawing of what the center of town might be. In other words, they're thinking about it both very much visually and aesthetically, but also very much in terms of just making it happen. And one of the things that they decide to do is to experiment with different types of houses. And it wasn't as straightforward as I thought it was, but there's a set of houses that's built right off the bat, which they invest a lot of money in. They then, in between them, build houses that look the same, but are construction-wise cheaper. And only at the end did they develop Oak Road and parts of Garden Road, which were intended to be really low-income housing. They weren't even sure they were going to keep the houses there. In the end, they were kept, but they were supposed to be only semi-permanent. And luckily for me, these people knew how to document what they did. And I'm sorry that the images are so bright. I mostly just wanted to share with you just how meticulous they were with what they did. Creating different types, thinking about how to balance them and so on. Recording how electricity is being used and so on. I'm mentioning all of this, assuming that you've probably heard much of this story, but it is important for where I want to go next. And many of them lived here. One of the people whom I follow quite a bit is someone named Carroll Towney, and he and his family lived at 85 Pine Road. On the left is an image that was published in a landscape architecture magazine showing their garden and how important it is. And on the right is I know that this house has since been, is being renovated right now. This is an older photo that I took of it. And they're extremely proud of their work. This is really important because it's really nice to be visionary, but if you are not getting recognitions and accolades and pay for what you're doing, the visions usually fizzle out. But people start coming and mostly to see the town before they even come to see the dam. For architects and landscape architects and people who call themselves regional planners, there wasn't yet a degree in regional planning. It was usually architects who became regional planners. This was Mecca. This was the most amazing thing. This was what they didn't think would happen in their lifetime. An opportunity to really see and feel and walk through a town that was based on these principles and that was supposed to support community and have a green belt and all of these things put together. But architects like to design things. And the same time that this is going on, the dam is being built. And now I really apologize, but this is an amazing series of photos that I found completely by chance because the archives are down in Atlanta. And there's no order to them. This is actually every 2 weeks they take a photo of how the dam was being built. And the important thing about this is that the dam was being built to designs that the Army Corps of Engineers had made in the 1920s. Following, in 1920, there was the, a large federal act that authorized the federal government to manage water and to manage rivers in the United States. And so they sent the Army Corps of Engineers, which was the only outfit they had to do such work, to actually survey all these rivers and think about them. And if you're interested in seeing what they designed, we have copies in the library at the university. And the important thing for our story here is that for the Army Corps of Engineers, the architectural design of the dam was very, 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 very low on their list. And in what they planned was that the spillway would actually come where the visitor center is now, not in the center. The powerhouse would be right center, in the center of the dam, and the substation would be on top, on the roof of the powerhouse. And then the powerhouse is finished with really nice neoclassical details, which I'm not against them. I teach neoclassical architecture. But for the people working here, and especially for Roland Vanck, this was terrible. And his argument was that it's time to make things, if you don't make things look beautiful and exciting, people are not going to get on board with the vision. So he proposes the changes and creates and basically gets approved the dam as it looks today. And the point I want to make is just that he's using this too as part, yes, he's talking about this as a visionary, and talking about I'm committed to the TVA and I want people to understand the river machine. I want them to understand why we're doing this, why we're buying land and so on. And that if people come to a beautiful place, they will feel that, they will get it. Part of his argument was people might not understand how a dam works, but they know if the railing is comfortable or they know if the chairs are good. And partly also this is his currency in his professional life. Being published like this, and this is the powerhouses too, And this is again in the Architectural Forum, just 4 years later, after Norris is published, is the way to make the ideas, make the vision available to other people. And the TVA capitalizes on this. There are so many photographs of Norris Dam and some wonderful interpretations of them. But I like the one on top is a couple almost kissing with the lights of the dam in the back. And as one scholar points out, those are the kinds of pictures that people were taking at the Niagara Falls and things like that. So the TVA is putting the dam at the level of Niagara Falls and inserting its own ability to do resource conservation into the story of what's great about America. And Vanck also says it's not just a matter of what people are going to look at. They also have to be able to make it to the dam. They need to be able to appreciate the dam. So all these other things that I include in the dam tour, which is why I began with a few of those images. The circle, the visitor center, this was the original version, the one that's there now is the fact that you can come at night and see it with all the lights. People are still surprised when I tell them that's true. The fact that you can see it as part of a landscape are all things that were completely intentional and part of the vision. We believe that resource conservation, in other words, government responsibility, centralized organization of resources, is the right way forward, and we're going to make it acceptable to people. And that also includes the buildings in the state park. The TVA designed them, but didn't actually build them because of just the way that things were worked out. The National Park Service took them on, and they were built by CCTV. Not CCTV, sorry, CCC, the Corps, the Civilian Conservation Corps. But Roland Vanck was constantly looking for more ways of showing the vision in different things. And one of the things that he got very involved in, pretty much leaving the architects of the TVA kind of alone to do their own thing, was in designing buildings for electric co-ops around the valley. Because the government could produce electricity and could build transmission lines once that was approved by the Supreme Court. They could not sell directly to individual customers. That was not allowed. So as part of, similar to what they were doing with the land machine, of you organize and we will give you fertilizers and knowledge and then you use them, the same idea was used here. Organize as co-ops, buy the electricity from us, and then you can sell it to consumers. And so Vanck recognizes the opportunity to make these buildings as well into beacons of what the TVA is doing, how it's changing, how it's shaping the valley, what is the meaning of the government getting involved in electricity. All of this becomes the basis for everything that happens after here. The TVA can't build another Norris, but everything that they can repeat, they do. So if you travel around to check out the dams, which I may have done, you find that they are all of a family, beginning with Norris Dam. That's the one where everything started. They look different. The only two that are identical are Douglas and Cherokee, which were built during World War II. Otherwise, each one of them is unique, but at the same time, they're very clearly part of the same family. Even the small ones, like Chattooga, up in the mountains. And what they really enjoy is thinking through the powerhouses, the power station, the turbine halls. And architecturally, even if you take it away from the vision and the TVA, and just look at the turbine halls as a series of design spaces, they are certainly worthy of a lot of the attention that they got. And there's few still remaining of the buildings that Vanck and others built with the Ruhr Electrification Authority and the TVA that they built such buildings for, for the co-ops, for the electric co-ops. Some of them still exist, most of them don't. So that's one way of saying this is what happened with the vision. The architects recognized opportunities that weren't there at the beginning, recognized an opportunity to visualize and materialize ideas that people were devoted to, and then found multiple ways to actually use them. And in this, Vanck was very much the important person, looking up, pushing, suggesting, going to the board, convincing Lilienthal, convincing other people, and so on. But the story doesn't end there. I'm sorry, this would have continued even after Arthur Morgan is kicked out, and the idea that the TVA really is just about resource conservation, and that the main idea is that you need to respect decisions of the people of the valley through their elected officials, becomes the main norm in the TVA. These sorts of things, building the dams, designing the dams, and so on, this could have continued. What was amazing to me, though, is that the other group of architects, the ones who had been thinking about housing and about communities, found a way to continue doing things as well. And this is the last part of the story. So to build this many dams across this wide region, you have to move a lot of people. You have to house them. And you have to house them temporarily, but not for a week or two. Some of the dams took 4 or 5 years to build. More than that, Arthur Morgan, from the beginning, said, we won't just subcontract out the work. We will hire people directly, and we will give them housing. This was part of his vision of regional planning and of resource conservation, included this attention to good housing and good environments for people to live in. What this meant is that even though the TVA was stopped from building another permanent Norris, they really were invested in continuing to build temporary Norrises for another 20 years after Norris was complete. Not every single dam had a full-blown construction camp and village. Some of them, like Chickamauga, were close enough to Chattanooga that there wasn't a need for that much housing. But for the next 20 years, there's a large group of architects who are completely invested in doing this. And for many, if you look at what they produced, it doesn't look anything like what we have here. But in terms of the vision, in terms of their attention to how people would live together, how people would come together, how to site the buildings, how to site the houses, and so on, they are very much continuing the vision that they started here in Norris. And I just like, oh, I'm sorry, this is really probably, you can't see it all. But one of the ways in which they really think through this is about dorms, about bunkhouses, how to design a good bunkhouse, which to me is not a terribly interesting question, but for them it was as interesting and as important as part of this idea of creating a good environment and including regional planning in construction camps were Kentucky and Fontana. Pickwick and Wheeler were also very large, but the ones where a lot of the attention was given was in Gilbertsville, which was later named Kentucky, and eventually in Fontana up in the mountain. So they're doing this, and they have an audience for this. They're publishing reports saying very clearly, this is what a responsible government does, is provide these sorts of environments. And we're going to tell you, we practiced, we tried, we built Norris, then we built it again, then we built it again. It may not be as permanent, but it still had the same pieces to it, and we're going to tell you what it's going to do. But what they really got interested in was the question of houses. And that's why I said a little bit, but not enough about the houses, and the fact that here, the laying out of the houses, the orders in which the houses were built, the materials the houses were built from, the way they were sited and so on, was something that they truly believed in. For them, that was the key to everything. If people didn't have a good house that provided them shelter, but also provided them with an opportunity to live a good family life and to grow spiritually and emotionally and intellectually, then everything else fell apart. And for them, cabins in the mountains were definitely not good enough. But even the farmhouses, I found pictures of farmhouses that were here on this land before Norris was built, and some of them are very nice houses. But for these progressives, even those farmhouses were not good enough because they were a series of rooms where it just was one room opened into another. The houses that they offered here had corridors and had more privacy and had porches and things like that. And for them, these were the keys to a good family life. You're welcome to differ. I'm just saying, I love my porch, but you're welcome to differ. So they've designed the houses, they've thought about them. As I said, there's a first round at full price. Some of the houses that were built here were as expensive as an architect-designed house I apologize, as an architect design house outside of here. But the second round of houses, which are in between, were already much, much cheaper. And certainly what they built on Oaks Road and so on was already, they could rent it for what workers could afford. And so the question in their mind becomes, how do we make these houses available to as many people as possible? In other words, the vision is not just about the quality of what we're doing, it's also about the quantity, which to me is taking an idea from regional planning and moving it into resource conservation. And moving it into resource conservation and saying if housing is indeed a resource that people need so as to live the life that we want them to live and create the society that we want, we have to offer that resource. And so already in 1938, they're beginning to think about low-cost versions of their houses. The main person behind this is someone named Louis Grandgent, and this is a model that he made. I'll be honest, I've looked at this photograph a lot, and I don't know what the difference between this and a more expensive house is. But the main thing was that they were willing to try out all sorts of new materials, including asbestos-based materials that we no longer use, in an effort to create houses that would last 2 or 3 years and would provide what they wanted, but could still be temporary. The place where they tried this first was Hiawassee Village. And so some of the houses are actually named that. And I think that some of the houses in Kentucky, let me give you the exact name, Kentucky Dam State Village State Resort, which is what the construction village of Kentucky Dam has become. I think that some of them are, if not exactly the same, still modeled on that. But that's relatively easy. That is more a matter of engineering than it is about architecture. What they really, really get excited about is the idea that you can move houses. Because wait a minute, if a house is a resource, and we're needing to move people all across the valley, and we need to give them houses and so on, why don't we reuse the resource? That's the whole point of resource conservation. And so the first time they try this is in 1938. They take houses from Pickwick Landing, which, as I said, was one of the big villages. They literally cut them off their base. They drag them with a tractor. They load them onto barges, and they float them down the river to Kentucky. And I'm pretty sure that I have, that I know some of the houses in Kentucky that were actually moved from Pickwick. And for them, this was a great opportunity to say, listen, in Norris, we invested a lot of time and effort on siting, on giving people privacy, on making space for gardens and so on. In Kentucky Village, we may not have, we saved by moving the houses so that we could do that kind of work. In other words, we're keeping that part of the vision, but adjusting it to the fact that we're moving houses on barges. But the thing about architects is that they don't like makeshift solutions. And if they can design it, it's better, even if it doesn't make a difference. Don't tell them I said that. And so what they do, so as they're doing this, and as the engineers are being convinced that these crazy architects might actually have a good idea, and you can move houses, it's not quite as crazy, and it might even be efficient. They go back and they say, remember when Louis Grandgent had by then left to work for other housing authorities, remember when he was still here, he actually drew an idea of what it is to prefabricate a house. In other words, to design a house that can be made in pieces and moved. And the thing about this house, if you can see, those of you can see, design, in terms of its appearance, it's not terribly special. But what was special about it is that all other designs for prefabrication of the time, and there were a lot of them, this was a topic that a lot of architects were thinking about, were made out of panels and bits and pieces that you brought together. Grandgent said that doesn't make sense because that means that you're producing some things in the factory, but then you're doing a lot of work on site. Let's do more in the factory. Let's build sections and bring the house in sections. And I'm sorry if the image is not that clear, but this is actually a house cut into sections. And as I said, he'd already left, but Carol Towney and others who had been part of his crew, they say, this is another place where we can take our vision of providing good resources for people and and our expertise in building things, and the fact that we're part of this big thing, and we have to build houses. We have the opportunity to try it out, not just talk about it, but actually do it. And they begin a series of experiments. In fact, they call it research. Partly so as to say, we're not designing this for people. We're researching, and then we'll tell you what's good, and you'll believe us. But we're not designing it for you. And they start a series of experiments. They really pick up once the World War II begins in Europe and the United States enters a different economy, and Muscle Shoals is retooled to produce munitions and so on, and then there's just need for housing there. So they contract out to work for the Defense Department and so on. They're not only working for themselves. And if you're interested in the details, I'm glad to tell you more, and they're mostly chapter 5 in the book, in minute detail. But the main thing is that they're expressing their vision by being cutting edge and by using the fact that they are part of a federal agency, a public agency, to try things that individual architects and small companies might not be able to try. And eventually, by the time as I said, Kentucky was a very, very large one. Fontana is another large one. There were points when the construction of Fontana Dam was at its height, when there were more people living in the construction camp and village than there were in the entire county, Graham County. So in other words, the TVA building Fontana Dam was an enormous demographic change for that part of the mountains. And one of the things that happened there, and it happened in all the camps, it's just that here I happen to have found some old photographs, is that people were building a lot of makeshift housing, which to these designers and architects was the sign that they had failed. That if they could not provide enough housing for people, then this would. And so in Fontana is when they really go all out, and they also start to investigate not just building things that can be built and then put together and moved in sections, but actually working with trailer companies and designing some of the first trailer houses. This is the production in the, and then moving them, and this is what they actually looked like. Once I found the outtakes, Fontana Village was a mess. People were living in all sorts of things, but the images that were sent out were of, I think one of the women there is smoking, and others are playing cards. This was the good life. This was another way that their vision was brought to fruition. And I'm sorry, this is just the way that Micah and I sort of tried to chart going the whole way from the house in Norris to a trailer house as a continuous vision about what is important and why it is important. I have one more turn of the story and then I'm done. Even while the war was still going on, the TVA architects, by now they're no longer the Land Planning and Housing, they're called the Department of Regional Studies, are continuing to draw. The person who's behind most of these drawings is named Gurney, just an absolutely beautiful illustrator. They're continuing to draw. Of course, some of what they're doing is also working for Oak Ridge. They're continuing to publish. They even make models of all their system and what it looks like so as to be able to really show things. And one thing I think is fair to say is that Clayton Homes, in a way, is the descendant of what the TVA did. And for these architects, this would have been a wonderful resolution. This would have been resource conservation. We developed the resource of how to build houses more efficiently, better houses, and then it was used by individual companies, in this case Clayton Homes, and certainly a big part of what we still see today. But what's fascinating to me is that they keep on drawing these drawings, and slowly the drawings become less about houses and more about vacation homes. And I'm sorry if this is not clear, but in here you see a house which in other drawings is being used in Oak Ridge or in Fontana or in Muscle Shoals, to house a family who are producing things for the war. And here there are umbrellas, there's fun. And they even go further. 1944, before the war is officially over, they develop a proposal for using their system to create vacation cabins, much smaller. So part of this is the larger story about the valley section. And about this idea that there needs to be a fit between people and their environments. When Petra Geddes described the valley section, he's describing an environment that has not been mechanized, as Micah and I call it, has not been interfered with dams and moving and fertilizers and all of these things. The TVA brought in and certainly created a lot of beautiful parts of the environment, but that came with problems too. And I'm sure you know them as well as I do. What happens when the water's low, in other words, right around this time of the year, and there's stretches of TVA people would call it submarginal land. Land that can't really be used for anything. You can't grow on it, you can't build on it, you need it so as to be able to allow the water to rise, but et cetera, et cetera. And even the reservoirs, now we think of them as lakes, but, which is partly what the TVA landscape architects were doing. But when they were built, they were flooding some of the best farmland in the valley so as to create a reservoir. In other words, turning it into unusable land. So here's where the vision is another aspect of the vision that connects more clearly with what Benton Mackay was thinking about with the Appalachian Trail and so on. Very early on, already in 1936, the landscape architects who are part of my atelier, or the atelier, say, wait a minute, we should not just support farming, we should not just support electrifying farms, we should also be thinking ahead on what people are going to make money from. And one of the things they can make money from is recreation. And for that, we need to be in charge. And this is Micah's redoing of a map that we found in the archives in Knoxville, where basically landscape architects simply took the maps of the entire Norris Reservoir and said, okay, what land should be public, what should be private, what should be here, what should be here. In other words, organized it, designed it, took a vision and made it into a vision. And Norris Lake does have more public land around it than most of the others, but some of the others do as well. And they also went a step further, and they said in the same way that, and I apologize if this is very pixelated, but I'm not sure you can tell the difference from the back anyway. In the same way that the farming and the fertilizers, we produced the fertilizers but gave them to individual farmers. We produced electricity and gave it to, sold it to individual people. We should be doing the same for when it comes to recreation. So we should build parks, like the state park, as examples. And they build several parks, so they call them demonstration parks. Pickwick is another, and there are a few smaller ones, but most of them are here on Norris. But then they're also thinking, well, what is the commercial thing to do? And to me, it's fascinating. They actually sit down with the map and they say, okay, we've been thinking about Norris Reservoir as a big reservoir and not caring about who owns the land and what county it's in, because it doesn't matter to us. But in terms of developing commercial recreation, that's going to matter. And they begin by placing marinas, one for every county. And this is something I'm still working on. So this is still a bit kind of in flux, but the oldest marinas, and this is not going to be a complete list, but it includes Hickory Star, Cedar Grove, and Waterside, which was originally the Andersonville docks, are all part of this very clear attention to, it's a resource to have a dock, to have a marina is going to be a resource. We're going to help invest in it. I've been reading the contracts that were made with individual dock operators, and they're very interesting about what you'll invest, what we'll invest, what does that mean? And then there are a lot of marinas that are much later that come in as are part of a different story. What they also have to contend to, and now I'm getting back to those cabins and to this, and this idea that you take houses and use them in other ways, was the fact that the federal government is coming back and saying, wait a minute, all that land buying that you did, if you don't need that land, you have to sell it off. You are not allowed to own it. So already in 1939, The TVA is beginning to sell land around Norris and around Pickwick and around Wheeler and around the other reservoirs that are ready. At some point, they're able to stem that a little bit by arguing that a lot of what it's doing with the land is for recreation, and including recreation in basically folding that into the TVA Act and making it a legitimate reason for the federal government to hold on to land. And that's partly why so much of TVA land is also recreation and not just But they're looking and they're saying people are going to be buying land, they're going to be building houses. And our vision is that the environments are good environments, not just haphazard. That people have distance, that houses are at a distance from other houses, that the roads follow good routes, that you can approach houses in a good way. So they actually begin designing subdivisions, which was something I did not expect to find, thinking back on regional planning and the visions that they had. But to them, this was a continuous line. And so some of the, having driven around Norris Lake quite a lot, in some places you can still feel it, where you're in that part that was older, that was subdivided very carefully, where houses have views and things like that. What I'm seeing now more and more, especially towards La Follette, is a lot of development that doesn't follow any of these rules and regulations and is much more haphazard. As someone who's has a lot of affinity to regional planning, I'm upset by this. I'm not sure, though, that they necessarily would have been. A friend of mine visits this house quite regularly, and I think that the remodeling every year is about $1 million. And then this is one of the new developments, Deerfield Resort. I'm not sure that they would have been bothered. I'm not sure what they would have thought. Those who were really entrenched in the idea of regional planning would have said, okay, this is not what we meant. And all those great, big best practices that we developed, they've gone away. But those who were invested in resource conservation as an ideology and the idea of freedom of choice and liberty and so on, may well have said, this is what people want. We produced the resource, we produced the lake, and then it's not ours anymore. I don't know. What I do know, and this is the last slide, is that one of the wonderful things about thinking about architecture, and especially being a historian of architecture, is that you get to think about ideas and about visions and how they change and how they up and down and move and so on. But if you look at, if you're looking at visions by people who also had the opportunity to really build, you also get places where you might not even like the vision. But Norris Dam and Norris, but it's just the image that's currently my desktop, so I thought I'd finish with it, is such a special place and one that has drawn me back again and again and again, and I think the geese agree with me. Thank you very much. I am delighted to answer questions either here or there, whichever is better for you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sykes. Just a token of appreciation to the Norris Historical Society.
Oh, thank you.
Last,
I get my own.
In the last 90 years, we've managed to publish 4 books. So
thank you so much.
And I guess we can just